So this is the first episode of the Doers Club podcast. And I have a wonderful guest here who's also a friend from a long time ago. And what the Doers Club podcast is about is basically just creating a place to talk to people who are taking action to make the world a better place. People who are doing cool shit and trying to be solution oriented. We have here Polo, otherwise known as Thomas, uh, and he has been doing the green journey. So Thomas, do you want to kind of talk a little bit about it, or do you want me to kind of introduce it for you?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. And hi everyone. I'm super grateful and happy to be here. And thank you, Justin, for inviting me. So the Green Journey is a world tour without using plane and cars. And our goal is to go to all different continents to explore the different climate solutions that people are implementing in those places and sharing it with people to inspire climate action.
Yeah, and so I know as well that you're doing this with your partner Megan, and that the both of you met as consultants at McKinsey's ESG division. Yeah. And one
Yes.
of the things that I thought was really great about the premise for this journey is trying to ease climate anxiety. You know, there's a lot of people I think now who are much more interested in climate change, but can find it overwhelming and kind of despondent because of the fact that we're hearing so many bad things are happening in the world. And a lot of that has to do with kind of the media cycle and, the kinds of topics that get exposed on media. So I think it's so wonderful that you all are kind of combating that in the sense of trying to find positive stories and solution oriented things that we can do. So can you
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about kind of how far you are in your journey right now, where you've been? I know that you've been kind of around Europe. You've already been to at least 21 countries at this point. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yes. And just on your previous points, I really believe action against depression, because just like I think most people who want to work on the climate issue, we go through multiple phases, right? And one of the phases is eco anxiety. Like we look at the reports, we look at the physical impacts of climate change, and it's really pressing because everything is burning and everything is going down. But I think it's also super exciting because as a species, like we've never faced an issue so complex, but also that has such a potential to bring us like a better and fairer and society. And and that's what we want to focus on. We want to focus on hope. We want to focus on action and on solution, which is like people who are actually getting out there and working on making this place a better world. And we have many stories from the travel that illustrate that, and maybe we get into it a bit later. When it comes to the green journey, we started 6 months ago, so we started in France, and so far we've been to 25 countries in Europe, and that's using trains, buses, hitchhiking, biking, walking, and so on. And right now we are doing a very exciting step, which is sailing across the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. Because when you want to go to all continents without using any plane, there's not many alternatives, right? Like you have to sail. And so we started from Eastern Europe, and for the next 2 months, we're gonna be on a sailboat to make it to the Caribbean. Right now, I'm not on a sailboat. I'm in Italy, in Sardinia, because we had to stop because of a crazy storm coming in. And you can actually see behind me that there's some mast of sailboats. I'm in the marina. But yeah, the green journey will be going on for the next 3 years. So in 2024, we are going to travel to the entire American continent, so South, Central, and North America. And then beyond that, the goal is to sail across the Pacific and then make it to um, Australia, Asia, Africa, and then back to Europe to complete the world tour.
And I think I had heard something about the Atlantic Ocean is generally more difficult to traverse by boat compared to the Pacific. Is that correct?
So there are different times of the year. to do it. So sailing is all about timing because you have specific winds at certain moments. And now, like at the end of the year, like November, December, January is a good time to do it because you have certain winds that are coming from east and blowing west. So and they are like pretty consistent winds. So they are like it's basically a highway for sailboats, right? Like you have like that wind highway and you just like get on it and it brings you all the way to the Caribbean without really having to change anything because the wind is really consistent. If you do it at another time of the year, it's pretty dangerous because you have like hurricane season. Um, when it comes to the Pacific, I actually don't know yet. All I know is that the Pacific is half of the world, right? Like in terms of length. So it's going to be 2 to 6 months at sea. That's what people say to cross the Pacific, which is, I'm not there yet, right? Like we're not there yet. So we're taking one step at a time. Exactly.
Oh my goodness. Okay, 6 months is crazy. And we were talking a little bit about seasickness. I certainly get seasick, and well, hopefully after your Atlantic leg, you'll be an expert, and you won't have seasickness anymore.
Let's see.
Yeah. Okay. And then I just wanted to talk a little bit about how we know each other because it's actually so relevant to this podcast. So the way that Polo and I met is through this, I guess essentially it was like a student consulting group called Bay Area Environmentally Aware Consulting Network. And so we all just call it Beacon as the acronym. And so that was back at UC Berkeley when we were in college. So it feels like a lifetime ago now. But Polo was actually an associate consultant on my team back when I was a project manager, and he did such an amazing job. I mean, we had a great team in general, but I was very impressed by all the work that you did. And obviously, you went on to go to McKinsey, so they were also impressed by your consulting skills. But what was kind of a blast from the past that I wanted to bring back was our client at the time was one of the biggest like composting and recycling companies in the United States, and they handled the San Francisco Bay Area. And so some of the kind of solutions that we were proposing at that time as just college students, I feel like for me at least have kind of shaped the way that I think about climate problems and how to approach them. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, totally.
Um, yeah, and then I know as well, Paul, that you had started actually the ESG team at McKinsey when you kind of started over there. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was a great experience. It was back in 2020, where there were a few people at McKinsey who were getting together and starting to serve clients on ESG. So for those who don't know, ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And the idea is that companies should not be investors should not invest in companies just for financial reasons, not just for like their financial performance, but also for their extra financial performance, which means like, of course, when it comes from the environment, how much emissions they are producing, how much resources they are using, how much water, how much waste, and so on, but also on social, like how are they treating their employees, how transparent is their supply chain, are they using any forced labor in their supply chain, and in governance, like how I guess like transparent and clean is their governance, right? Like are there any scandals of corruption and so on. So it's like you can think about like all the different indicators of the performance of a company that are not financial by nature. And it's a pretty new and exciting field. And we just got together with a few people from McKinsey and started serving clients on it and actually build like a dedicated service line focused on those questions. So it was a very exciting time, and I did it all the way till I guess like spring of 2023 when I decided to leave the company to start the green journey.
Yeah. And then kind of the last little through line here is that both of us have actually done some long distance biking. So I didn't get to ask you as much like before we kind of had like a pre-call for this. But can you tell me a little bit more about where you've traveled to by bike and if that at all like influenced your decision to start the green journey?
Yeah, no, totally. So before, back in 2020, I did something fairly similar to you, where I biked from my hometown in France, which is on the western coast of France, to my grandparents' house in Italy, which is near Venice. And So that's like roughly 2,000 kilometers. So I biked all the way south to the Spanish border, the Pyrenees, and then all the way east across, like along the Mediterranean coast, and then across Italy. And it was super fun. Really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed, the feeling of freedom and being close to nature, and setting your own pace. And I think biking is a great pace to see things because it's slower than like a car or a train where like you can't really see like the landscape changing that much. But it's also faster than just like hiking and walking, which to me is like a bit too slow to see everything I would like to see. So it's that perfect compromise, right? So I did that before the Green Journey, and then with Megan, when we started the Green Journey, we knew that there were some places we wanted to bike in. And we really like biking near the water. And so we decided to bike along the similar like Mediterranean coastline in the Balkan countries. So that's from Venice in Italy to Athens in Greece. So it was 2,000 kilometers across 6 countries in the Balkans, following the Mediterranean coastline. And we did that in July and August this summer, so a few months ago, which was really hot, but really exciting because we had the water to jump in like right next to us.
Yeah. No, that sounds beautiful. Along the coast, I mean, I would hope that it's a little bit flatter, but you must have had some portions that were pretty mountainous, just given the terrain,
Yeah,
huh?
that was actually our thinking as well, and we were very wrong because the Balkans are like anything but flat. Um, and so yeah, they were like quite some hilly portions, and we and you know it, right? Like when you bike without any stuff on your bike, like it's fine, right? Like you can go uphill easily. But the minute you start carrying, like, I don't know, your tent or like your gears or whatever, like it's a whole different game. So we definitely had to take our time on the uphill portion.
Yeah. And then on your previous bike trip before the Green Journey, were you also doing bike packing? Like, did you have the tent and do you like cook for yourself as well with like a little stove?
Yeah. So with Megan we did. When I did it solo in 2020, I was pretty lightweight, so I was just sleeping in a hammock and buying like a sandwich at like a local bakery for my dinner. So I was not carrying a stove. I was pretty lightweight.
Mm-hmm. You must have lost some weight then, because one of my favorite things about biking long distance is that, anytime you eat, this is fuel, so I just pig out.
Yeah. Yeah, no, yeah, totally. Actually, this summer with Megan, we were carrying like a little stove that can only boil water, so we could not cook many things. And one of the things we could cook is gnocchi. The pasta based on potatoes because they
Yeah,
they cook quickly. And so we had gnocchis, I think, for like 50% of our meals, which is amazing. But now, yeah, we can't really like eat gnocchi anymore because we've had
yeah,
too much of it last summer.
yeah. You well-deserved break
Yeah.
from that. Okay, awesome. So I wanted to kind of start getting into the meat of things in terms of the climate action lessons that you've had so far on your journey, because you've been kind of going for quite a while now. So one of the first things I really wanted to center on is any stories that you've heard from climate activists from local communities who are, being personally affected by, climate change. Do you feel are really doing important work? If you could share any of those stories.
Yes, totally. So with the Green Journey, we really go meet people on the ground, right? So um, we are interested in people working on solutions to the climate crisis, and solutions come in many different shapes and forms. And of course, one of them is activism and local activism. So over the past 6 months in Europe, I think two stories are particularly interesting to me. The first one was in Poland, so in Eastern Europe. And in Poland, at the border between Poland and Belarus, you have a forest that's called the Białowieża forest. And that forest is the oldest forest in Europe, which means that it's the only place in Europe where trees have not been cut down historically. So it's the last like primeval forest. And obviously that place is extremely important from like a climate and biodiversity perspective. And back in 2017, the Polish government started to cut trees down again. And for different reasons, but the takeaway is that they were not really allowed to do that. And so activists got together, and there was what we would call a triangle of activists that got together. They were the vocal, physical activists. The person we interviewed described them as tree huggers. So they would literally chain themselves to trees or chain themselves to the machines that were going to cut trees. And by how vocal they were, they attracted the media and media attention. So that's like the first part of the triangle. The second part is because it attracted the media, then the media started talking to scientists. And scientists are like the second pillar of that successful story, because the scientists brought credibility to the activists, and they were able to tell the media how important that forest was. And the last one is the lawyers. Once the media was paying attention to it, there is a group of environmental lawyers that got together and put together a case, and they brought that case in front of the European Court of Justice. And they asked the European Court of Justice to tell the Polish government to stop cutting trees. And they did so, and in 2018, the European Court of Justice ruled on the fact that the Białowieża forest in Poland was indeed protected and that the Polish government had to stop their action. And to me, it was very interesting how it's climate action, climate activism is an ecosystem where everyone has to play their part. And if you remove one of the angle of this triangle, it doesn't work, right? If you remove the activist, the media will not come. If you remove the scientist, the vocal activists will not get credits for their action. And if you remove the lawyers, nothing gets set in stone. So that was a very interesting example, in my opinion, of how they got to work together and they ended up protecting that like really unique place in Europe. So that was the first story that inspired me. I think the second one was in Albania. So Albania is in southeastern Europe, in the Balkans. And in Albania, there is the last wild river in Europe. And what we call a wild river is a river that has never been dammed, or like that it is not dammed. So the water can run freely from the source to the sea or to the ocean. And all of the major rivers in Europe have been dammed, except for that one, which is called the Vjosa River. And it's really important. Historically, it was important to dam a river because hydropower is a clean source of energy. But nowadays, when sun and wind is incredibly cheaper than hydropower, and when most important rivers have been dammed, there's been a movement to ask for like not damming more rivers. And so the Albanian government wanted to dam that specific river to create hydropower. And that would have put underwater many villages in the area. And what's more interesting is that area has an incredible potential for solar energy, because the Balkans get like 200 to 300 days of sun a year, and solar energy can be distributed easily because you don't necessarily need to rely on the grid. So there's less cost on like a hydropower plant that then needs to be connected to the grid and so on. And so we went there to a village that was gonna get underwater if the dam was built. And there was what I found really interesting is that when you hear climate activists, you think about Greta Thunberg. You can think about young, more like urban populations who are like taking to the streets with like signs and asking their government for action. There, it was completely different. They were all 60 to 80 years old farmers that got together, chained themselves on the roads, blocking one of the main highways of the country for months and months and months, asking their government to stop that project. And once again, they were so vocal about it that it brought media attention. And in the end, Patagonia, the clothing brand, also got involved and asked the government to like stop the project. And it made the Vjosa River, that wild river, a national park.
Mm.
Um, and so that that form of activism is actually really exciting to me because it's a different type of activism. It's like multi-generational, right? It's like really underrepresented communities, which is like basically old people, right? Like taking it to the streets and asking their governments to protect to protect their area, and that's climate action as well.
Yeah. No, I love that because I think that there's an unfortunate ageism both at like either end of the spectrum that is very like you can see it a lot in the climate movement because it is primarily a youth-driven movement. And I think it's wonderful that I think here in LA, for example, our district representatives have like youth reps, they have applications for that, they have a strong focus on trying to get that voice out there, which is wonderful. But I think for our generation, sometimes we kind of write off older folks, thinking
Yeah.
that they will not care about these issues. And I think also just remembering, for example, back in the 60s, these people, there are people within every generation who have kind of spoken truth to power in that
Yes.
this is not right, whether that's, you know, things regarding, war or regarding climate change or various other issues. And I think that it's important to keep in mind to try to look at things more from a values perspective and not write people off just based on their age. So I think
Totally.
that's great.
Totally.
And then the
Just
other,
to
go ahead.
add very quickly on that, I totally agree because many of the people we interviewed were really like impactful people in the climate movement. They were not many of them were young, and they were like men, they were women, and one of them was we always saying that like baby boomers don't care about like climate and they like ruin the planet, and one of them was a person in Denmark who was probably like at least 70 years old, and he was one of the creators of like a community wind farm on the coast of Copenhagen, and his name was Hans, and yeah, he was like probably 70, 75, like a grandfather, and like 20 years ago, he got together with their friends, and they started building that wind farm project. So yeah, we need baby boomers, we need everyone in the climate movement.
Yes, exactly. We don't have time to be selective regarding that anyway.
Yeah.
Um, and then also something to be said about the different kinds of solutions that stakeholders bring, right, from their lived experiences. Um, but the one thing I did also want to touch on was regarding the triangle of climate activists that you talked on. Having that mixture of community activism, scientific kind of backing, and then also the legal aspect. And one thing I kind of like heard as well as you were talking is media is like another thing. I don't know where it fits in the diagram, but certainly without having media or people like you who are bringing these stories to the forefront, none of this can happen as well. And I think that's one of the positive things about how interconnected we are with social media. People love to talk about kind of how bad social media is, but being able to connect with people across the globe, that is something that I think is it's one of the greatest presents that we've received from this technology.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I totally agree.
Okay. Yeah. The other thing I wanted to kind of talk to you about is you have this interesting experience having been kind of on the business side with consulting and focusing on ESGs at McKinsey, and then also now doing the Green Journey. So, what do you think are kind of the strengths and weaknesses of a social entrepreneurship model versus government intervention when it comes to addressing climate change?
Um, so when you mean social entrepreneurship, do you mean the private sector
Yes,
versus government
exactly.
action? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think both are needed, right? You're never gonna solve the climate crisis without the private sector because that's also where you can, have access to talent, have access to capital, and so on. but at the same time, we cannot just rely on the private sector to solve the climate crisis. Because at the end of the day, the private sector will always, that's their definition, will always pursue the profit, right, in a capitalism society. And so the government action has to be both the carrots and the stick, in the sense that they have to provide incentive for the private sector to evolve their business model, but they cannot just rely on incentive. They also have to have the stick aspect, which is like saying that certain things are not allowed anymore, right? Like certain business models are not allowed because the external negative externalities on society are just too important. So I think that they need to work together. Um, and one of the great examples that we've had last year, right, is the Inflation Reduction Act, the almost $400 billion that the Biden administration is putting on the table, which is mostly incentives, and it's asking, and it's showing companies that there is like there's a financial um, incentive for them to change their business model, because before that, really, it's really hard, right? Because when you are in like capitalistic society, really, as a company, if you want to survive, you have to make more profit than your competitors, right? Um, and unless we change the basics of how that society works, the private sector is not going to change the rules, right? It's up to the government to change the rules. So I think they are both obviously like extremely needed, and I really disagree with people who say that the market will regulate themselves and like free market will be the solution, because we've had like 50 years of history to show that it's wrong. Um, but at the same time, like a government only approach is not enough, because they don't have enough capital and talents to mobilize for the emergency we are facing now.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think when it comes to government, what they do is they set the parameters, right? Like they set the baseline. This is,
Yes.
what we as a society will accept and will not accept. And I will say that in the US, we've been, we're a capitalist country. We tend to lean much more towards letting the market kind of run itself. And obviously, the United States is one of the biggest polluters and the biggest carbon emitters in the world. So there's certainly something to be said there in terms of what are we going to set the standard for, and also that businesses anticipate changes in legislation and account for that in their financial planning. So
Yes.
it's something that it ripples through the private sector. With there was, I think, at one point in California, the electric car kind of incentive that we have for consumers lapsed for a period of time, if I remember correctly, but then now it's back. And so manufacturers know if the incentive goes away for consumers, that their sales could take a hit there. And so those are ways in which we see the private and public sector, kind of riffing off of each other in a sense. And I was curious as well if there's any additional examples that come to mind of good or really bad public-private partnerships in the climate change space.
Yeah, I think a bad example is what is going on in France now, with highways. So it's slightly different than in the US, because in France the state will basically will lease an area to a highway constructor, or to a company that will build a highway, and will charge money with tolls to users of that highway. And right now there's a very contentious project to the southwest of France going on, where basically they are there's a project to link two different cities with a highway, where a road already exists, and it will basically put concrete in hundreds of acres of land to make people just save a couple of minutes on their commute from that one city to another, instead of obviously investing in trains, right? Which is the best climate option. And it's a bad example in the sense that the state is giving away a potential for revenues for the government to then invest in the transition, and B is choosing a form of transportation that is not compatible with a climate safe future. So it's like an example of like a pretty bad public-private partnership. And versus like a good one could be like train, right? In the US, there's amazing opportunity for better passenger trains, right? Transportation accounts for like almost a third of, I think it's like close to 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions of the US, which just as itself is more than most of the countries of the world, right? And most of that of those emissions are coming from cars. And for me, like you and I, we've lived in California, right? And we've done the commute, like the road trip from San Francisco to LA a few times, just like most Californians.
Yeah.
It's a straight line where there's space between the two highways for a nice, beautiful high-speed train that would bring you from downtown San Francisco to downtown LA in like 2 to 3 hours. What's going on, right?
Hearing about that.
Like where is, and we shouldn't rely on like Elon Musk and like Hyperloop type of project, because that's like not gonna happen, right? We just need like and that's like a potential for like a great public private partnership where the government will put like and they've showed us that they can put billions of dollars on the table for great infrastructure projects, and then you can have a private company operating the trains. That's something I would love to see in the US.
Yeah, no, I am on the same page. Oh my goodness, that would save so much time. And the other thing I love about public transportation, just from a personal aspect, is not having to focus on the road. You know, you can
Yes,
really like read. I used to back when I was a pre-med, I used to do my homework on the BART on my way to work. So there's lots of benefits besides just the climate aspect when it comes to public transportation.
totally.
Yeah. So we're kind of talking a little bit already about policy aspects and differences between countries. And the last time that I was in France, I was really impressed by the use of compostable like utensils and packaging. And I know that at that time, France had recently passed legislation to phase out single-use plastic by 2040. And I do feel like, you know, from the media that I've received regarding France's commitment to addressing climate change, for example, the successes that they've had in cleaning up the Seine River in anticipation of like the 2024 Summer Olympics, I feel like that has been a great win. And I'm, you know, here coming from the US, and you know, we love to complain in the US about our government, as you know. But I was just curious from your perspective, having lived in both countries, you know, what do you think are the things that the US and France can learn from one another in tackling climate change?
Um, yeah, I think first of all, I'd like to say that the French government is quite an expert when it comes to climate communication and less so in terms of climate action. Um, the rate of emission reduction in France is emissions are reducing, which is a good thing, but they are decreasing twice as slow as they should be to meet the Paris Agreement targets. So there's still a long way to go. That being said, I think one narrative, one conversation, when in the public debate that is happening in France and is really lacking in the US is the demand side solutions. And what we mean by demand side solution is reducing demand. The number one solution to solve the climate crisis is reducing demand. What do we mean by that? You have to go from point A to point B, like for instance you have to commute to your work. Can you actually do it remotely? You think that you need to buy that specific table, that specific chair, that specific any type of item or services. Do you actually need it, or can you find it secondhand, or can you find it an alternative in your home? One and the IPCC report is pretty clear on that. Without demand side solution, without reducing demand, we have no way of solving the climate crisis, right? There is no there's like a safe climate, the infinite growth in a planet with finite resources is not a thing, right? And like mathematically, I think everyone can understand that. So, but it's really not something that we here in the US, right? Even if you think about at the Green Journey, we think a lot about transportation, right? And we think a lot about flying, right? Because we have to get to places without flying. In the US, the like low carbon travel, the flight free travel is not part of the public debate. A, because there is a lack of alternative. There is no high speed train. So if you need to go from Chicago to Denver, while like it would be extremely fast to do so on a train, you cannot because the alternative is not there. But B, because it's also not part of the public debate. So I think one thing that like France and Europe in general are doing well is that they are engaging on those conversations, and people are starting to question their consumption habits in terms of goods, in terms of services, and that's great. Um, on the other hand, what the US is doing great, and I would say that's a pretty typical American way of solving problems, is that they are throwing a lot of money at the issue, right? And it's right? Because at the end of the day, the climate crisis needs tremendous amounts of investment to decarbonize our society. And the Inflation Reduction Act, once again, is like a great example of a functioning administration getting together and putting hundreds of billions on the table for that change. France is not doing so not in the same ambitious way, I would say. We need 2 to 3 times more public investment on decarbonization in France. And I think that will be coming, but there's an issue where they invested a lot during the COVID crisis, right? So because they protected workers a lot, like they paid wages when people were not able to go to work and so on. And that created a lot of public deficits. So that's something that they're trying to figure out how to find the public money when the deficit is actually pretty high. But that's, in my opinion, one thing that the US is doing pretty well is mobilizing the public money to decarbonize the economy.
Yeah, I would 100% agree. I think that the demand side, when it comes to consumerism and how that is fueling climate change, is very much an underrated strategy that's not talked enough about, certainly in the US. And I feel like the thing that's a little bit sticky there is that a lot of governments are trying to decarbonize growth versus pursue degrowth, which is kind of the terminology that's often used regarding basically us spending less, using less, living basically a lifestyle that is more in line with staying within our resources on this planet. But the problem with that is that, certainly the markets rely on essentially infinite growth, right? If I'm putting money towards a retirement fund today, I am hoping and expecting that by the time that I am ready to retire, that portfolio will have grown. And so there's certainly an economic aspect that I think is not totally selfish. It's not totally, people being greedy, but certainly, you know, people want to be able to retire, right? And we don't have good safety nets, I think. Certainly in the US, I feel like we need to do a much better job in making people feel secure, that they do not need to be constantly pursuing more in order to be safe financially. And so that is
Yes,
very much tied together.
yes, totally. And I
Yeah.
think when we talk about reducing demand, when I talk about reducing demand, I'm not saying we should go back to the Stone Age, right? That's really not what I mean. It's just questioning, right? Oh, do I really need this? Do I really need to buy that? Can I do otherwise? And I think starting that, like once again, there's some nuance, right? Like if we take the medical field, for instance, like I believe in infinite progress in the medical field, right? Like that's not something we should question. But one thing is like the cruising industry. Do we really need the cruising industry in 2023 when like that industry is clearly not compatible with a climate safe future? That I'm not so sure. And once again, questioning like as a society, like what do we need versus not?
Yeah. And just to touch a little bit more on the medical side of things, that's something that, over here at USC, we've been talking about that. And there's like a new coalition that's been formed of Southern California hospitals that are trying to decarbonize, which I think is wonderful. Um, and I will say from my experience that there is so much waste that goes on in the hospital. Not all of it, I think, is necessarily bad waste. Like you could say there's a little amount of friction because of the needs regarding sanitation. But there is certainly progress that can be made. And part of it is, I think, a mindset shift. I think in a lot of healthcare, we give ourselves a pass saying that we are saving lives and therefore, whatever it takes. But for example, there was a talk by, I forget her name, but she was the founding director of a like sustainability and healthcare center at Yale. And she came and spoke, and she is an anesthesiologist by training. And so in anesthesiology, there's a lot of medications, a lot of, essentially kind of poisons that we give patients to get them sedated. And some of those are much worse for the environment than others. And there's been some research done by her group showing that using some of these more sustainable anesthetics are actually equally effective. So every patient wants to make sure that their care is not going to be compromised. And so we need to obviously strike that balance of, where are the points, the high yield points where, we are delivering the same quality care, but at a much lower, carbon footprint. So hopefully in the next 10 years or 20 years, that will be something that's like much more on the table. I think we're starting to make some strides, but it's an early conversation, certainly.
Totally.
Um, yeah, so one of the other things related to this that I was curious if your perspective has changed on this in terms of individual sustainability practices. And we're kind of talking about that already with, demand side, but some, there is some critique of practices such as recycling, composting, plant-based eating in terms of, certain advocates stating that, no matter how much we try to push ourselves as consumers, the bulk of emissions are actually coming from, just a handful of large companies. So what is your response to that?
I have so many doubts about individual actions to solve the climate crisis. There's a few studies that have shown that 25% is roughly what you can do with your individual action. So recycling, plant-based diet, and so on. So what does 25% mean? It means that it's part of the solution. It's not like 2%, but it's not all the solution. Okay. So when that said, like I encourage people to think about systemic action instead of individual action. And what does that mean? It means that let's take recycling, for example. You can spend your life recycling. It's going to have way less of an impact than if, for instance, you get elected to a local board of your community to improve the recycling practices. Let's take and that's really what I mean by systemic action is thinking about how you can impact a group of people instead of focusing on just your single action. And I don't know if you know that, but there's a few like a carbon footprint calculator online, right? Where we can say like, oh, like I drive like X number of miles per year. I like eat like that number of times meat per week and so on. The the people who invented the carbon footprint calculators is BP, British Petroleum, which is an oil and gas company. And to me, it's a fascinating thing, and it's actually brilliant from them. It's really evil, but it's really brilliant from them. It's saying, okay, we know that we are responsible for the climate crisis, but we're going to create a tool to make people think that they are responsible for the climate crisis. And that's what I mean, right? Like 25%, it's important. Like I really encourage people to decrease their meat consumption, to once again avoid, like reduce their demands when it's not relevant. But please, don't feel guilty when like you put like a piece of cardboard in the trash, right? Like because when that's the case, it really takes your mental energy away from what matters, and what matters is systemic action. One thing that is important to precise on systemic action is that, of course, we are not all equal when it comes to our ability to create systemic action. What I mean by that is if your work is um, if I don't know, like you have like a manual work and you have like less potential for impact, you have less of a responsibility to create systemic action than if you are like an executive or a company, or like if you are like the owner of your own business, or if you are a professor at a university, or like if you have like any type of job with a responsibility and with a responsibility on many people and many organizations. So once again, like please don't feel like bad, like don't feel too bad when like you feel like you're not doing enough for the climate when you just focus on your individual action, because at the end of the day, that's what the biggest polluters want.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree about not letting yourself be guilty. There's only so much that we can do as individuals. And thinking of it also at the individual level from a systemic approach, like when it comes to, for example, I have my own kind of like reusable cups or utensils. There might be times where I didn't bring the bag that has those in it. And so therefore, if I do want to get something to drink, you're going to be using a disposable cup. And so I try to mitigate that, right, by if it's recyclable, recycle it. But there are going to be times. And so if, oh, why was it that I left, my reusables at home today? What can I do next time to try to avoid that rather than feeling really down about myself and beating myself up? It is really interesting to me to hear your perspective because for myself, I'm a little bit more optimistic about individual interventions. And kind of part of where I come from there is I feel like it's a statement of value, that regardless of how much of an impact this may make or not make, that this is what I believe. And so I know that, whatever little impact that I can have, I want to try to avoid that. And I do think that there is a good case in like particularly so for me I'm vegan, right? The preponderance of options that are now vegan in grocery stores is primarily consumer driven, right? Companies are only responding to demand there. So I think that I'm a little more optimistic than some other folks like who I talk to about this. I certainly agree that systemic solutions are needed. And I like to kind of think of it as like do both,
Yeah.
together in the way that you're able to. But
Oh,
yeah,
for sure.
overall, yeah, totally
Yeah,
agree.
for sure. I mean, 1 + 1 = 3, but like, I think I totally agree with you on the signal of value. And to give you an example, for years, I think food is a very, very interesting example. Because going back to the signal of value and the demand side, my approach is that I never purchase meat or fish. But if I get invited, like on the road, you get invited by people, right? And very often they would cook meat. I would not refuse it, right? Because I would feel bad. And for instance, like if my grandmother like prepares me like a meal with meat and I refuse it, like I'm not allowed to sleep in her house at night, you know? So, but when I never purchase it, right? So like by not creating the demand, we are not creating the supply, right?
Mm,
So that's a place where it's really relevant. And I think that the last thing I'd like to add on that is you'll see once you start liberating yourself from the guilt of, oh my god, like I forgot to bring my like reusable bag, or oh my god, like I didn't like recycle that specific thing. When you start, it doesn't mean like you shouldn't like care at all, right? But when you start like releasing yourself from that guilt, you'll see that you have more mental capacity to think about systemic action. So in your community, like what is missing to have like clean transportation? Like, is it like are bike lanes missing? Okay, well, if bike lanes are missing, maybe you can attend the next public meeting at your city hall and you can ask your representative to create bike lanes, right? And you can like think about that, like start thinking about those systemic actions because you're spending less of your like mental energy on your like individual small action.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Another thing I wanted to ask you is in regards to kind of like your personal growth, as whether that's as like a leader or as a climate advocate, with the time that you've had on the green journey thus far, how do you feel like you've grown the most?
Um, yeah, I think one thing, and I definitely have a long way to go still, is like climate communication and talking about climate to people who don't really know much about it or like are not really interested or like are skeptical about it. Um, and of course, when you travel, you meet people from very different types of paths and from different countries who have different responsibilities historically in the climate movements. And adapting my messaging to those different audience has been like a phenomenal challenge and somewhere where I've been growing and I continue to grow, and that's something I'm very excited about for the rest of the green journey.
So, how are ways that you've tried to kind of adapt your communication? Because this is very important to me because I always think about preaching to the choir, you know, just being in our little circle of people who all care about the same thing. And it doesn't really, you don't really need to convince anyone regarding the importance of climate change versus talking to, for example, some of my relatives who are not as interested in this topic and getting them, to care.
Yeah, I think to me it's always starting from a place of care and empathy, and often people are already actually taking climate action but they are not aware of it. um, and an example would be like how like my grandparents, because of the way they grew up, they like reuse everything, and like my grandfather has like it's like such a an example for me. He has a knife that the blade is so thin now because he's been like sharpening it over years and years and years so that he doesn't have to like buy another knife. That like to me it's just like a different mentality, right? And you cannot go to your grandparents and be like, oh, like you guys didn't do much about like climate change because they are like obviously using less and purchasing less than like most people around me because of the way they grow up, right? And going back to the demand side, right? Like most people would have like purchased like 10 knives, right? Instead of like sharpening that one knife. And it's so what I mean by like a place of care and empathy, it's like I think like shaming the individual is the best way to miss the climate transition, because shaming people who take their car to go to work is like the best way to to get to exclude them from the climate fight, right? To exclude them from the climate movement, because often those places, those people, they don't have an opportunity, right? But instead, like seeing like the good in people and saying like what they are doing good as climate action, instead of like, oh, like you're polluting with your car because you have to drive to work every day. That's something I really believe in, bring positivity and bring empathy and focusing on what people are doing.
Kind of related to that, having been to so many countries now, you said 25, how have you been dealing with the cultural and language barriers there?
I mean, I think so far, because we've just been in Europe, it's okay, right? Because you have somewhat of a gap in certain more like Eastern or Southeastern European countries, but when you're in the European Union, it's somewhat homogeneous, right? A lot of people speak English in urban environments. You have like somewhat the same, like especially if you go to like a bit more touristic areas, like people are like used to strangers, or at least used to travelers. But I think like in next year will be an interesting challenge because it's traveling to a lot of Central and South America. And for me, a very important part is about language. And the first thing we do when we enter a language, a country, is we learn how to say hello, how to say thank you, and how to say goodbye. Those are like the three, because those three words open so many doors. When you start greeting someone, like let's say like with like hitchhiked in many places, and you like start talking about people, if you can, they can like give you a ride. If you start the conversation by saying like hello in the native language, you open a door that like you would not open by saying like good morning or hello in English. Um, and one thing I'm really excited about next year is like becoming really fluent in Spanish and learning some Portuguese to as we travel through all the Spanish and Portuguese countries in South America.
Wow, that's gonna be wonderful. Yeah, no, I've also been learning some Spanish just like for the hospital because you have so many Spanish
Yeah.
speakers in Los Angeles. So if you ever need a practice buddy or resources, let me know. I think that's really great because the thing is that I've seen when I've traveled with friends in the past sometimes, people not making an effort when it comes to at least those very basics, right? Anyone can learn a
Yeah.
few words. And back when I was in Kenya for a short period of time, like a month, and just learning a little bit when you're talking to the drivers, when you're talking to, I mean, in Kenya, it's a lot of kind of gated communities just because of like the state of the country and kind of that thing. So there'll be like security guards who come and check your car, like check even underneath your car, check the trunk, just because they've had a history of terrorism and bombing in recent years. And that ends up being weirdly like a place where you can kind of connect with people as they're checking your car. But all of that to say that I do agree, and I think it's wonderful that you all are prioritizing that as you're traveling. I can tell that's been like such a well thought out journey. That's going to be, I guess, 4 years for you almost.
Yeah.
So I can only imagine at the end of your trip, how you will have changed and grown. I'm excited to do that.
Hopefully.
It'll be one of two things, but no, I'm sure that there will be a lot of positives on this trip.
Yeah.
I think one thing I just wanted to close with, we are coming to our time, is what do you think are the biggest lessons that you would like to impart to a general audience regarding climate change?
The biggest what? Sorry, I missed that.
Lessons regarding climate change that you'd like to share with a wider audience. Like, here's your 1 minute pitch.
Yeah, I think many people get anxious and afraid when it comes to the climate crisis, and I would love to change that fear into action, and into hope, right? Um, and I think seeing that at the end of the road, like there's light at the end of the tunnel, and actually like a successful green transition means a better society for us. It means cities with less cars, which is like cities that are more quiet, that have more trees, that have more animals, that have more bikes, that have more like affordable working, clean public transportation. That's something I'm super excited about. And also when it comes to food, right? Like a successful transition means like more delicious, more affordable food, and not like food that is grown with many things that you don't actually want to know about. It's actually like a successful transition when it comes to housing. It's having like better and more relationship with your neighbors and with your communities, right? Because more things are used in common, and that's like better social connection, better social nexus, and that's something that makes us all happy. So at the end of the day, like it's really, and I've been in your shoes thinking that it's all gonna burn down and we just need to find an island to like purchase to be safe with your family, right? But that's actually not, like, I really encourage you to think about like the action that gets us at the end of the tunnel. And personally, I feel so much better and more in my shoes when since I've started taking action, right? And like since I've like started like being on this journey, yeah, action against depression. I really, really believe that. Because like a quick like a quick thing is like back in 2018 when we were studying at Berkeley, I was reading a lot of scientific reports on the likelihoods of everything collapsing, and it was really giving me a lot of anxiety, and it was really impacting my mental health. So I've been on like the depression side of the climate spectrum. I'm not just saying like it's all green and beautiful out there because I'm being naive, right? Like I've been in your shoes if you have eco anxiety, and I still have it. But I really do believe that if you start going out there and if you start like finding some people who have the same fear and the same doubt and the same anxiety as you and start taking action together, surround yourself with people who want the same type of future as you and start doing things together, and you'll see that your life will like significantly improve. I really believe that.
And one thing I'm hearing as you're talking as well is more of a human-centered approach to addressing climate change.
Oh, for
And
sure.
seeing what are the positives that we are getting out of even just the action of trying to address this problem, regardless of the outcome, right? Community gardens are such a great example of that.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about like sourcing local foods and having kind of reconnecting with the earth in terms of how, we eat, and knowing where our food comes from. So I think that's a great place to end. A couple things I wanted to just touch on really quickly at the end is as you're kind of coming to the American continent. I know you're still in Italy now, but once you arrive here, is there any kind of person or place that you're especially looking forward to seeing?
Yeah, we one of our big goal next year is to give conferences to universities to talk about our journey and the phenomenal people we've met and the actions they've taken. And we'd love to go back to Berkeley and meet with students there and talk about our travel. So that's something I'm really excited about.
Oh, nice. And if you want to come to USC, I don't know if you'll be making your way to Los Angeles, but just let me know as well.
Yeah, we will. We'd love to.
Great. And then one thing I was interested in starting on this podcast, given that it is called the Doers Club, is to give every guest a chance to kind of take on a challenge that they have been wanting to do. It can be big or small. I know you're already quite busy with your journey, but something that you feel like, hey, I've been wanting to do this, but just for some reason I haven't. Um, have you kind of state it on this podcast and then send a photo when you do it as some accountability? So, what do you think about that?
Yeah, don't worry. I love that. I think for me, it's two things. First one we've talked about is like learning Spanish. And I think the proof will be, hopefully I'll be, yeah, able to, interview people in Spanish in South America.
Okay.
That will be pretty good. And the second one, and that's something I've been wanting to do on the crossing on the sailboat is to stop writing a book about our European travel, and about like the green journey in general. So that's gonna take a bit more time, but hopefully our book will one day be published, and
Mhm.
that will be the book will be the proof of completion of the
Oh my
challenge.
goodness. That could be years, but I'm looking forward to
Yeah,
it. Um, I think the Spanish could have much more of a short-term gratification aspect.
hopefully.
Okay, wonderful. Well, we'll see in terms of if you are feeling up for it at some point, if you want to send like a short clip of yourself, maybe saying whatever you want, like a sentence in Spanish. I would love that. And then maybe
Yes.
we'll put it up online. But okay. All right. Well, thank you, Polo. So nice catching up with you. I really appreciated it.
Thank you, Justin. Talk later. Bye bye. Take care.